All right, welcome you guys. Today we are going to continue our talk on ecology with population ecology. So we covered the biosphere last week, and now we're going to talk about how populations grow, how they maintain their size, how they can diminish, and what the effects are on the environment as well. So what we're going to be talking about today is population structure and dynamics. So that's really going to be about population size. What kind of factors regulate a population size over time? So how do populations grow and decline over time, and what kind of factors play into that? And then we're going to talk a little bit about the human population, because I think that's very important to talk about, because our population is kind of getting out of control, and we don't really know at this point where our limitation is and what that may be. So what is population ecology, right? So it's concerned with changes in population size. So you're going to study population size, and you're going to study those factors that are going to regulate populations over time. So that is population ecology in a nutshell. So when you look at a population, you have to look at the individuals in that population. So individuals are going to rely on the same resources, so the same food and water sources, and protection, if that's a thing as well. So any of the resources that they rely on are going to be the same. So there may be some competition over resources. They're influenced by the same environmental factors, right? So they live in the same environment, so whatever's happening in that environment is going to affect all of the individuals in that population. Also, they're going to interact, right? So individuals in a population are going to interact with each other, whether that's positive or negative interaction. And there's a possibility of breeding as well. So that's also going to contribute to competition. So what is population size influenced by? So specifically, we can talk about birth and death rates, right? So if you want to increase a population size, you can increase birth rates or immigration, meaning individuals coming to that population, and you can decrease death rates or decrease emigration, meaning individuals leaving that population. So if you do either one of those or both of those, you can increase that population. So you can obviously do the opposite as well if we're talking about decreasing a population size. So this specifically is talking about increasing a population size. So there are going to be two opposing forces that are in play when we talk about a population size and how we reach a stable population size. So first you have their biotic potential, meaning what is their theoretical max rate at which a population can increase. So that depends on their breeding rate and things like that, how fast can they actually increase their population if there were no outside influences on that population. What is their theoretical max growth? So that's called the biotic potential. But then, of course, you obviously have environmental resistance, right? So this population is interacting with its environment as well. So you're going to have some factors that are going to prevent that maximum growth potential in the population. So these guys are going to be opposing forces to each other to essentially balance out the population size. So what kind of factors can prevent max growth? Well, they're all going to be getting the same resources, competition for food, space, interaction, right? Even natural events that can occur in their environment can also limit potential growth. So these kind of things are what are going to actually inhibit the overall max growth or max rate in growth of a population. So these two kind of balance each other out to create that population size. So not only do we have food and resource competition as environmental resistance, we also see predators as a very significant environmental resistance to control a population size. So if you were to remove or introduce a predator, this can really greatly alter a population or even a community as well. And so just for a great example, and I have this video and website on Canvas for you guys to watch the video. It's very cool and very interesting because it's happening just in our backyard on Santa Cruz Island, the Santa Cruz wild foxes. They had a huge decrease in their population and they tried to figure out why. And they realized that the native bald eagle was declining. So they got hit with DDT very hard, and so their entire population kind of got wiped out. And that was kind of the bird of prey in the area. And they fed mostly on fish. And so they kind of left the island foxes alone. And they also kind of kept away other birds of prey. But once they were gone, we had the golden eagles that actually came in and started to populate the island. And one of their favorite snacks were island foxes. So essentially, once the golden eagles took over, they started to eat the island foxes, and therefore their populations declined. So once they were able to figure out the balance in the environment with these predators, they were able to, along with a lot of other things that they did to help the island foxes, they did end up recovering the island fox population. So it's a great video about that process and what they actually had to do to recover that population. So what are some predictive growth patterns of populations? So a very idealized model of population growth is considered the exponential growth, or the J curve. So this is, how does a population grow under its ideal conditions? So kind of like that biotic potential. What can this population do? And essentially, it's just a continuously accelerating population. So you're just going to keep increasing the numbers. So we have an example here on the right of rabbits. And obviously, rabbits have a very short gestation. They have a high birth rate and breeding rate. So, obviously, every animal is going to be a little bit different, but they undergo this general J-curve exponential growth, right? So over time, you're just going to exponentially increase that population size. So obviously this isn't necessarily what happens in the environment, right? Because you have to take into consideration those environmental resistance. So obviously this is an idealized model, right, of what could happen. And we do see this under certain circumstances that we'll talk about. So when do we see exponential growth in the environment? So this is what happens when you have a reduced environmental resistance. So there could be certain circumstances that this may happen. So this is definitely seen after species recovery. So if something were to happen where a species is driven to almost extinction, you can see that in the recovery process of that species. So for example, you could, increase a food supply, or if a habitat is increased, right? So if they were nearly driven to extinction because of habitat loss or hunting, human predation, things like that, then you see that decline. But once you restore it, restore that food and habitat and prevent the human predation, then you can see this exponential growth in the species. And that's what happened with the whooping crane. So in about the 1940s, they were almost nearly extinct due to habitat loss and hunting. and there were only about 15 birds left. So the habitat, they restored the habitat, preserved their habitat, and essentially these environmental resistances were reduced for the whooping crane. So we did see an increase in their population, but they're still one of the world's rarest birds, and so they really need to have this continued population growth to fully recover as a species for long-term survival. You can also see it after predation is reduced. So we could go back to our example of the island fox, right? So if they removed those golden eagles, or their main predator, then that population can recover and undergo that exponential growth. We can also see exponential growth with invasive species. So these are species that aren't normally in that environment or in that habitat. And so if they're introduced into, a non-native habitat, they may outcompete the native species in that area. So this is kind of what happened with these cane toads in Australia. And they were introduced only about 100 in kind of the early or late 1930s. And now there's over 200 million cane toads in Australia. And there's a crazy video about how invasive and rampant these toads are in Australia. They're just everywhere. They're definitely kind of a nuisance now for the people living in Australia. So this is definitely something that is seen with invasive species. And you can talk about that with plants, animals, anything that can outcompete those native species. So another model that predicts population growth is the logistic population growth, or the S-curve. So this is a little more realistic to what is happening in the environment. So a population is going to increase or have that kind of exponential growth up to a maximum number. And that number is what the environment can sustain, essentially. So you have your environmental resistances, which are going to determine that population, that max population size. And then it's just going to sustain itself and stabilize. And where it stabilizes, or where it kind of flattens out on that S-curve, is called the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is that max population that the environment will sustain. So that's what a carrying capacity is. And this is much more realistic in our environment and what we see most often, because you have that growth, and then the environment will tell you where it reaches that carrying capacity. So this is an example of our fur seals, is a standard S-curve shape. So there are many factors that are going to limit a population size. So let's talk about a few of those. So first, we have density dependent factors. That means that it's related to the population density. Okay, so when you see this, that means that the population increases, right? So you're going to increase the density of a population. And then you get these density dependent factors. So for example, you can have intra-specific competition, meaning that individuals of the same species lead to competition, and you get a decrease in birth rates or an increase in death rates. Okay, so it's kind of the opposite that we talked about before. So this is going to decrease a population size if you were to decrease those birth rates or increase the death rates. So some examples of that On the left-hand side, we see some sponge sparrows that essentially, with their increasing population density, they actually had a decrease in reproduction. So the more females that you had, the less offspring they were able to have, because maybe they were competing for resources, things like that, right? So these density dependent factors. Same with the kelp perch, right? So the more numbers, the increase of the population density, increase the mortality rate. So as they got higher in the population, more and more perch, they actually increased their death rate or their mortality. And that could be from parasites, disease, right, that maybe spread more rapidly if the population is too high, right? So these factors are density dependent factors, right? So it depends on that population density. So it increases with the population density. So our second type of factor that can limit a population are density independent factors. So these are limiting factors that are unrelated to the population density. So it has nothing to do with how many individuals you have in a population. So these could be abiotic factors such as weather. So these can be populations that just have a cyclical cycle with the weather. So for example, these aphids essentially eat the sap or sugar from plants. And so when the plants die off in the summer, May through August, there's a sudden decline, right, in that population. So through the spring, they get an exponential growth with the plant growth. And then when those plants die off, they essentially have a sudden decline in their population. So these types of factors can really keep a population in check before the density dependent factors kick in, right? So it kind of keeps them at a limiting population size before you get any of those, competition or disease or anything like that that is density dependent. So this is density independent, it has nothing to do with that population size. So then we also have this kind of boom and bust population cycle. So essentially you have, a dramatic fluctuation in the population density, but it's a regular and cyclical fluctuation. So this could be due to factors such as food shortage or even a predator-prey interaction. So for example, here we were looking at the snowshoe hares. And essentially, if you look at the snowshoe hares, you get this, exponential growth with a sudden and massive die-off. And so they were trying to figure out the cause. Is it overgrazing and then they starve to death, or could it be excessive predator prey? And so they actually radio collared the hares, and 90% of them were being killed by predators, none from starvation. So then they looked at their predator population, which was the lynx, and essentially it followed a very similar cyclical pattern. So essentially when the lynx population got low, the hare population dramatically increased, and vice versa. Once that increase in the hares, then you had an increase in the lynxes. And vice versa. Once those hares die off, then the lynx dies off. So you have this very similar pattern of this boom or bust population cycle. So let's pause the video and do a little bit of review. So answer these questions and then we'll go through them. So what type of graph shows an accelerating increase in a population size? Can this type of growth continue indefinitely? What are two types of outcomes that often follow this type of growth? And then name some density independent and dependent factors that can influence a population size. All right, so what is that type of graph that shows an accelerating increase in the population size? So that's our exponential growth, or our J curve. And can this type of growth continue indefinitely? No, it usually can't, right? Because you're going to have some sort of environmental resistance. So what are two types of outcomes where we actually see this type of growth? Well, we see it with recovery of a species, right? And invasive species. And then what types of density independent factors and dependent factors? So we talked about our density dependent factors first. Those are the ones that depend on the population size. So as the population density increases, you're going to get more competition, decreased reproduction, increased mortality. Right? So whether that's competition, disease, anything like that that's density dependent. Versus your density independent has more to do with the environment. So maybe the weather, right? Something like that that has nothing to do with the population size. So now let's talk a little bit about the human population. So if we actually look at the human population from the Stone Age to present time, it took over 200,000 years to get to a population of 1 billion. But since the 70s, it's just been going crazy, right? So we had this exponential growth. But is it becoming logistic? Is it starting to plateau out? Are we hitting our carrying capacity? We just don't know, right? Time is kind of needed to see if we are going to plateau. It's been growing very rapidly since the industrial and medical advances since the 1970s. And so currently we're at about 6.7 or 5 billion, right? Something like that. And you can actually check that link I have for you that actually has a running total of the world population. And it's kind of fun to go and check that out. So there's definitely some series of advances that have increased our Earth's carrying capacity for the human population, right? So what have we done to increase our carrying capacity? Well, we learned about agriculture, right? So we can grow our own food. Technology and culture, right? So fire, tools, weapons, hunting, culture, right? Clothes, shelter. We could now live in more areas and more biomes of the world, right? Industrial and medical advances, right? Sanitation, so decrease in disease, antibiotics, vaccines, decrease in death rates, right? So we've really reduced some of those environmental resistance pressures, right? So we have done that. So we kind of reduced our own environmental resistance, and therefore we have increased our carrying capacity for our population. But where does that end, right? Where are we actually going to win? Maybe is the better question. Win, and how much is that carrying capacity of the Earth? We just don't really know, but maybe we're almost there, right? A lot of people. So what's interesting is that the human population is continuing to increase, but our growth rate is slowing a bit. So that could be an argument for reaching that carrying capacity of the Earth. So if we look at that table down on the right-hand side, you can look at some population changes kind of estimated since 2012. So if you look at the world birth rate and death rate, that's fairly high, right? So high birth rate, low death rate. So we have this kind of increase. But if you actually look at more developed nations, such as the demographic transition in Mexico, you're actually looking at a very similar birth rate to death rate. So essentially the birth rate has decreased and the death rate has increased. So maybe these could be things that are density dependent factors, right, that are going to be decreasing your birth rate and increasing your death rate. Whereas when you look at these less developed countries or developing countries, their death rates are about the same as the world, maybe a little bit lower, and their birth rates are high, right? As high as the world or maybe a little higher. So they are increasing their rate, their population growth, right? So it's kind of interesting to see that difference between the developed and the less developed nations of the world, right? But as a whole, we still have a higher birth rate than death rate. So the question we have to ask ourselves, essentially for that carrying capacity, is do we have enough resources to keep up our growth, right? So if we're in essentially an exponential growth phase, where, can we keep that up and for how long? And so when we actually look at an ecological footprint, which is really just the measure of resource consumption. So how many resources does it take to feed or provide for an individual? So it's just an estimate of land and water area required to provide those resources for an individual to keep them alive, essentially, right? So if you actually look at the ecological footprints of, kind of these global hectares per person, what kind of land and water area do we need for the individual? And you look at the different countries around the world and what kind of the world average is versus what our Earth's biocapacity is, right? What can the Earth actually sustain? Right? So we are, as an average, above the Earth's biocapacity at the moment. So if we continue the way we're going, right, that's not going to be sustainable. And then if you look at different countries, right, you have some extremes like the United States, right? So our ecological footprint is huge. So if we were to say for the entire world to live at the same standards of an American individual, we would need 4 Earths to provide the essential nutrients and everything that the United States uses, which is kind of something to think about. But also, we're aware of that, right? Being American citizens, we know that we have it good compared to the rest of the world. Because if you look at some of these other countries that are well below the world average, well below the Earth's biocapacity, these are developing nations, right? So kind of something to think about. So another thing to consider, as our human population increases, we actually see the extinction of other species increasing as well. So essentially for us to survive and grow the way we are growing, we are impacting the other species of the world, right? Because obviously the world can only sustain so much life that if we're taking up that life space, then other species are not. So essentially, if you see the growth here, the human population is growing, but so are the extinctions. And extinctions go in a cyclical pattern, but this is outside that cyclical pattern. So a lot of people are saying that we're kind of headed for a 6th mass extinction. So we've had some mass extinctions over the history of the Earth, and they're saying that we're kind of heading that way. But just something to think about, right? So if the human population increases, the extinction rate also increases for other species. So I know there's a lot of differing opinions on how to reduce ecological footprints or how much should we care about reducing our ecological footprints. A lot of people out there agree that something needs to be done because our Earth can't sustain what is happening in our growth currently, right? So obviously, every individual doesn't really make much of an impact, but if everyone can do their part, then maybe we can make a difference. So here are just some ideas, that you've probably heard before on how we can reduce our ecological footprint, right? So reduce your use of single-use disposable plastics, right? Get that coffee mug that you can refill, right, instead of the Starbucks cups. Switch to renewable energy, right? Reduce the use of our non-renewable energy. Eat less meat, right? So it takes a lot more energy to produce a cow than it does to produce corn, right? Recycle responsibly, right? Make sure you know what's recyclable and how to recycle it. Just reduce your waste in general, right? Driving less, maybe biking more or using public transportation, which obviously is a lot harder in our area. Reduce your water use, right? So water at smart times of the day, and support locally, buy things that are grown and produced locally. So these are just obviously some ideas that on how we can reduce our ecological footprint. But again, it takes everyone to kind of make a difference, right? So anyways, let me know if you guys have any questions. Otherwise, we will continue our ecology talks next week.